3. A world apart. The familiar chime of the academy bell echoed across the courtyard as students streamed toward the grand assembly hall. Unlike the first year, there was little hesitation in their steps. They knew where they were going, where their classmates usually gathered, and which professors were likely to be watching from the sidelines. Ventis smoothed the front of her lovely mage robe before joining the flow of students. It felt different this time. Last year, she had walked through these halls feeling like an outsider, painfully aware that she had been a commoner only months before. Now she recognized faces in the crowd. Students nodded politely as they passed. Some even greeted her by name. It wasn't home, but it no longer felt foreign either. As expected, the assembly hall was reserved for students alone. Pokémon remained in their houses or the training grounds for the ceremony, much to the disappointment of many partners. Lady Ventis. She turned just in time to see Prince Augustine weaving through the crowd. His smile nearly split his face. "There you are," he said, abandoning royal restraint for all of 2 seconds before catching himself. "I was beginning to think you had decided to skip the opening ceremony." "I don't think Professor Harbour would ever forgive me if I did," Augustine laughed. "That's exactly why I believed it was impossible." The easy conversation drew a few curious glances, but unlike last year, nobody seemed particularly surprised to see the prince speaking with Ventis. After a full year together, the sight had become almost ordinary. Almost. "Morning?" Marianne Tidewell arrived a heartbeat later, wearing the same bright, infectious smile that never seemed to leave her face. "It's nice seeing everyone again. I couldn't wait the end of winter." Her cheerful tone earned an amused chuckle from Augustine. It does when professors assign enough reading to fill a library. The three chatted comfortably while more second years filtered inside. Across the hall, Olivia Haxon had frozen the moment she spotted Ventis. She was here, safe. The knot that had quietly sat in Olivia's chest since the end of winter finally loosened. Relief washed over her. Then guilt followed close behind. She lowered her eyes for only a moment before composing herself, offering Ventis nothing more than a polite nod from across the room. Ventis returned the gesture. That was odd. Olivia's expression had lasted only a heartbeat, but it hadn't escaped her notice. Relieved. Almost. Ashamed. It didn't fit the Olivia she had come to know over the past year. Whatever it was, Ventis chose not to pursue it. Not here, and certainly not in front of half the academy. Students gradually found their places as the hall filled. Cedric Ironhill stood with his usual rigid posture, speaking quietly with Lucien Valtier while Lucia listened beside them. Roland Ashmere was already telling an animated story that had Marianne trying and failing not to laugh. Celine Everbrook stood quietly nearby, while Colleen Mistbound looked just as shy as ever, despite having survived her entire first year. The conversations slowly faded as the great doors behind the stage opened. Headmaster Titus Glacier stepped into view. The elderly mage carried himself with the same quiet dignity as always, his sapphire robes immaculate, his expression calm as his eyes swept across the assembled students. Titus waited until the hall had fallen into complete silence before stepping to the front of the stage. A gentle smile settled on his weathered face. "To our newest students, welcome to the Royal Magic Academy." His gaze swept across the nervous first years before shifting to the familiar faces scattered throughout the hall. "And to those returning, after successfully passing your year-end examinations, welcome back." A ripple of polite applause echoed through the assembly. "It pleases me to see so many familiar faces once again. Each passing year at this academy asks more of you than the last. The lessons grow more demanding, the expectations higher, and the standards by which you will be judged ever stricter." A hint of amusement crept into his smile. "I am afraid I can promise that none of your professors intend to make this year any easier." A few chuckles spread through the hall, even from some of the older students. "But with greater challenges come greater opportunities. Every lecture, every examination, every success, and every failure is another step toward becoming the mage, scholar, noble, or leader you aspire to be." His eyes finally came to rest on the fifth years gathered near the front. "And to those beginning their final year within these halls, your journey here is nearing its end. I hope each of you strives with everything you have to earn the recognition you seek, the positions you desire, and the future you have worked so diligently to achieve." He gave a respectful nod to the assembled students. "On behalf of the faculty, I wish you all a productive, rewarding, and memorable academic year. Welcome to another year at the Royal Magic Academy." The banquet following the opening ceremony was much the same as the year before. The only real difference was that Ventis could now immediately spot the first-year students. 6 young nobles stood together near the entrance, all wearing the same uncertain expressions she remembered having herself. They looked awkward for only a short while before gradually mixing into the crowd, drawn into conversations by the older students. Instead of lingering to watch them, Ventis made her way toward Prince Augustin. "Thank you," she said with a respectful bow. "Huh?" Augustine blinked. "The ring you gave me." Ventis smiled softly. "It saved my life." The prince stared for a moment before slowly nodding. Oh. His expression turned thoughtful. "Of course. I heard about the assassination attempt, but I didn't realize the assassin got that close." He let out a quiet sigh before smiling again. "I'm glad I gave it to you." "So am I." "Actually," Augustine continued, "I wanted to thank you as well. Thanks to your advice, I now have a Vaporeon on my team." "That's wonderful." Ventis smiled warmly. The conversation soon drifted to lighter topics. Marianne joined them before long, along with several of their classmates, and they spent the banquet reminiscing about their winters, sharing stories, and enjoying far too much food. Before Ventis realized it, the afternoon had slipped away. By the time she returned to our house, the sun was already beginning its descent. "So," I asked with a smirk, "did you eat yourself stupid again this year?" "I have to take care of my figure, Fenn." She gave an exaggerated huff. "If I get fat, Robert might think less of me." "Sure, you're always welcome to join our physical training." I casually spun one of my weights around my hand. "Nah," she waved dismissively. "Professor Garrick's classes will whip us back into shape soon enough." She grinned. "Besides, I finally get to battle alongside you. Remember? Professor Clash said we'll be having proper duels this year." "Oh, yeah," I scratched behind one ear. "I was a little annoyed last year when he kept saying we weren't ready for real matches." I shrugged. Not that anyone besides Duot would really be much of a challenge. Ventis's smile faded ever so slightly. "About that, are you sure you're ready to fight again? After what happened?" A chuckle escaped me. I still know how to hold back. I shook my head. "That was a life or death situation. This is completely different." I smiled reassuringly. "I know the difference between trying to kill someone and trying to win a duel." "Good." Ventis nodded, visibly relieved. "Oh, by the way," I said, my smile turning just a little too innocent. "Without looking at your notes, tell me how a water molecule reacts when exposed to high concentrations of fire-aspected mana." Ventis froze. The color drained from her face as her shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're quizzing me?" "I am." She let out the weary sigh of someone who knew there was absolutely no escaping. With all the enthusiasm of a prisoner marching toward the gallows, she did her very best to remember last year's lessons. The first proper day of classes began much like it had the year before. Professor William Dawnmore strode into the classroom with the bearing of a veteran officer inspecting his troops. His uniform looked as though every crease had been measured with a ruler, and his posture was so perfectly straight that it almost looked uncomfortable. "Welcome back, everyone." His sharp gaze swept across the room. "This year, you'll be spending considerably more time outside than inside these walls. Since you've already learned the fundamentals of defensive magic, I intend to personally evaluate how much you've retained." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "By attacking you with spells." "Excuse me?" Celine Everbrook shot to her feet. "Sir, no offense, but that sounds incredibly dangerous." "Not at all." Without the slightest concern, Professor Dawnmore reached into his desk and produced a silver medallion. "The Academy has prepared these protective amulets specifically for this year's defensive magic curriculum." He held it up for everyone to see. "Even if your own barriers fail completely, the enchantment within these medallions will disperse any spell before it can cause actual harm. At worst, you'll experience a harmless impact." His eyes drifted toward Ventis. "Lady Balatoa likely won't require one. Her ring carries a nearly identical enchantment." He returned the medallion to the desk before snapping his fingers. 10 sheets of parchment lifted into the air and neatly distributed themselves across the classroom. "Now then, before we head outside, let's see whether you still remember the theory behind defensive magic." He folded his arms. "Books away. Pens out. Test time." A collective groan spread through the classroom as everyone reluctantly stuffed their textbooks back into their bags. "And no cheating?" Professor Dornmore added in the same calm voice. "Should I catch anyone attempting it, they will spend 5 minutes kneeling on dry corn." The room became noticeably quieter. "I am so happy you quizzed me last night," Ventis whispered through our bond. "I didn't bother answering with words. Instead, I sent back a wave of smug satisfaction." The lesson passed quickly, and before long the class found themselves seated once again before General Hans Riverstone. The retired general looked every bit as elderly and frail as he had the previous year, yet the moment he began speaking, every student instinctively listened. This year's lectures abandoned broad strategy in favor of practical battlefield doctrine. He explained troop formations, supply lines, communication, and coordination between soldiers and their Pokémon. Every historical battle became a lesson, each victory or defeat dissected piece by piece until the reasoning behind every command became clear. It was astonishingly detailed. The old general discussed distances down to individual meters, the timing between commands, and even the angles from which different Pokémon should approach an engagement. To most of the class, it bordered on excessive. To me, it was fascinating. Finally, the class I had been waiting for arrived. Professor Zeke Clash welcomed us onto the outdoor training grounds. The arena looked exactly as it had before, as if Ventis hadn't obliterated a sizable portion of it during last year's accident. Not a single scorch mark remained. Professor Zeke Clash was already waiting on the training grounds, hands behind his back, and Ampharos standing proudly beside him. The moment the class assembled, his grin widened. "Now this is an electrifying sight. Welcome back, everyone." A few students chuckled. "Last year, we spent most of our time charging up your foundations. Offensive spells, control, accuracy." He waved a hand dismissively. "Useful stuff, but hardly enough to get your heart sparking." He clapped once. "This year, we're finally doing battles. Several Pokémon perked up immediately. We'll still polish your spell work, but from today onward, your partners will be battling one another on a regular basis. A mage who can't coordinate with their Pokémon is like a thunderbolt without electricity. Looks impressive until nothing happens." A few laughs spread through the class. "So don't just stand there like grounded Magnemite. Form pairs." Excited chatter erupted as students paired off. "Remember," Zeke called out, "these are training battles. No cheap shots after a knockout, no ignoring my whistle, and if I see anyone trying to overcharge the situation," his grin somehow became even wider, "I'll personally discharge you from today's fun." Even William Dornmore, who had remained to observe for a few minutes, let out the faintest sigh. The first battlefield was marked out. "Marianne Tidewell, Celine Everbrook, you're up first." Marianne beamed. "Ducklet, let's have some fun." The little blue bird happily flapped onto the field. Across from her, Celine gave a calm nod. Absol, the white disaster Pokémon, stepped forward with practiced grace, its crimson eyes never leaving its opponent. Zeke raised one hand. "Ready." His hand chopped downward. "Battle. Ducklet, Water Pulse." Ducklet immediately gathered shimmering water between its wings before launching the spinning sphere across the field. Absol, Quick Attack. Absol disappeared in a blur. The Water Pulse exploded harmlessly against the ground as the white Pokémon darted around it with ease. "So fast," Marianne whispered. "Now, Night Slash." Dark energy coated Absol's horn. With one swift movement, it crossed the remaining distance and struck Ducklet squarely across the chest and got launched backward, tumbling across the dirt before struggling upright. "Keep going. Wing Attack." Ducklet bravely took to the air, wings glowing white. "Detect." Absol stood perfectly still. The instant Ducklet descended, Absol shifted barely a step to the side. The glowing wings sliced through empty air. Finish it! Psycho cut. A crescent of psychic energy flashed upward, and Ducklet gave a startled cry before gently crashing onto the grass. A whistle rang out. Battle over! Marianne hurried over and scooped her partner into her arms. You did great, Ducklet answered with an embarrassed little quack. Zeke nodded approvingly. Excellent demonstration. Ducklet had spirit, but Absol never lost control of the tempo. Sometimes the best defense isn't blocking the attack. It's making sure it never hits. Celine gave Absol an affectionate pat before returning to the sidelines. Next pair, Roland Ashmere. Lucien Valtier. Roland bounced onto the field. Come on, Buizel, let's show them some speed. Buizel cracked its knuckles enthusiastically. Lucien walked much more calmly. Hatena, the tiny psychic Pokémon, quietly stepped forward, looking almost intimidated by Buizel's confidence. A few students exchanged doubtful glances. Poor thing. Buizel's going to run circles around it. Zeke blew his whistle. Battle! Quick attack! Buizel exploded forward like an arrow, hitting Hatena hard. Hatena! Confusion! The little Pokémon's eyes glowed blue. Buizel staggered for only a fraction of a second before powering through the psychic grip. Water gun! A stream of water slammed into Hatena, knocking it backward. Again! Finish it with Aqua Jet. Water wrapped around Buizel's body as it launched itself like a living torpedo. Several students were already shaking their heads. It's over. Lucien remained perfectly composed. Hatena! His voice never rose. Psybeam! Just before Buizel connected, a brilliant ribbon of multicolored psychic energy burst from Hatena. The attack struck Buizel head-on. The Aqua Jet shattered instantly. Buizel spun through the air before crashing hard onto the battlefield. Roland clenched his fists. Get up! Buizel staggered onto its feet. Hatena! Lucien spoke quietly once more. Disarming voice. The tiny Pokémon let out a beautiful, echoing cry. Invisible fairy energy washed across the battlefield. Buizel's determined expression faltered, wobbled, then collapsed. The whistle echoed once again. Battle over. For a second, the class simply stared. No way. I thought Buizel had it. That comeback. Zeke laughed loudly. Now that got me buzzing. He pointed toward Lucien. Never assume a battle is over just because one side lands the first hit. He then looked toward Roland. And don't hang your head. Your Buizel fought brilliantly. You simply forgot one thing. He tapped his temple. Battles aren't won by speed alone. His grin returned. They're won by trainers who keep their heads cool. A few more fights, and it came to us. Prince Augustine Vermont versus Lady Ventis Balatoa. The murmuring around the training grounds immediately quieted. Duot and I stepped onto the battlefield. I haven't been lazing around all winter. Duot rolled one shoulder before cracking his neck. And I heard even an assassin couldn't bring you down, so I won't hold back. He grinned. Oh, don't worry. I took off my hat and tossed it onto a nearby training dummy. I'd be offended if you did. Augustine took his place behind Duot, while Ventis stood opposite him behind me. Professor Clash raised his hand. Battle! Duot, raise a shell. Augustine ordered immediately. Fenn, use flame charge to dodge. Ventis called. I nodded and burst into motion, flames wrapping around my body as I accelerated. Then, my eyes widened. The spinning shells curved. What? Thin streams of water connected each shell to Duot's blades, allowing him to guide their flight even after throwing them. It wasn't anything like the battles from the anime I remembered. The projectiles chased me through my dodge before slamming into my back. The impact hurt, but what truly stunned me was the realization itself. That's not how Razor Shell should have worked. Duot! Aquatail! Augustine smiled, recognizing that I had been forced into close range. Fenn! Extreme speed into electric punch! I barely felt the water-coated tail graze my side, but since my earlier flame charge gave me all the momentum I needed, extreme speed easily activated. The world seemed to slow. Sliding beneath Duot's swing, I planted my tail against the ground, corrected my balance, and shot behind him in a single fluid motion. I deliberately held back. Duot was my friend. Still? My fist connected squarely with his back, electricity exploding across his body. Duot! The water type crashed into the dirt hard enough to leave a shallow groove. By Arceus! Zeke nearly leaned over the railing. A thunder punch from a brazen combined with extreme speed. His eyes practically glowed. I am absolutely paralyzed by that shocking combination. To both Ventis's and my surprise, Duot slowly climbed back onto his feet. He winced before flashing me a grin. Now that was a serious hit, Duot said. Augustine's eyes sharpened. Duot, hydro pump. Ventis blinked. Hydro pump? She immediately recovered. Fenn, dodge with extreme speed. I heard her. But I ignored the command. Sorry, Ventis. Through our bond, I gently closed off my pain so she wouldn't feel what was coming. I want to take this one head on. The torrent erupted from Duot's mouth with incredible force. I crossed my arms. The hydro pump slammed into me like a charging Tauros. Water roared against my body, forcing me backward across the dirt as my paws carved deep trenches into the training field. It was powerful, but I could already tell he had only recently learned the move. When the torrent finally ceased, steam rose from my soaked fur. I lowered my arms. A grin spread across my face. You only just learned hydro pump, didn't you? Duot breathed heavily but gave a tiny nod. I can tell. With more practice, it will hit even harder. Before anyone could react, I vanished with extreme speed. Appearing beside Duot, I gently tapped the back of his head with 2 fingers. His exhausted body finally gave out. I caught him before he struck the ground. Rest. Carefully, I carried him over and placed him into Augustine's waiting arms. For a heartbeat, the entire training field was silent. Then Zeke practically exploded. What? A battle? Tiny sparks danced across his sleeves as he threw both arms into the air. Now that is the kind of energy that gets me charged. Outstanding teamwork, creative use of movement, adaptation under pressure. He pointed dramatically between Duot and me. And most importantly, a broad smile spread across his face. 2 partners giving everything they've got without ever forgetting their friends. Give them a round of applause. With the battle class over, I was actually relieved that our next lesson was something considerably less exciting. Lady Yillette Harbour's magic theory. Of course, my attempt to catch up on sleep earned me a sharp slap across the nose with her ruler. Some things never changed. By the time lunch arrived, I was starving. As tempting as it was to fill my tray with cakes and pastries, I resisted. My body needed calories, sure, but it also needed plenty of protein if I wanted to keep building muscle. Not that it mattered much, I could probably burn it all off before dinner anyway. Ventis had changed her own eating habits as well. Gone were the towering desserts from our first year. Now, she filled her plate with vegetables, meat, and only a modest sweet at the end. Apparently, she intended to keep looking her best for Robert. This cafeteria is still the second best thing in the academy. I grinned at Absol between bites, right after Professor Clash's class. You still talk too much. Absol rolled his eyes before taking another bite of his meal. After a brief silence, he looked up again. Still, that was impressive back there. I raised an eyebrow. I didn't know your kind could learn a move like extreme speed. Even for a Pokémon with 4 legs, that's almost an epic tier skill. Well? I couldn't help smirking. It was nice hearing him speak more than a single sentence. I've actually been working toward it for nearly a year. I popped another piece of meat into my mouth. I first used it by accident, after overcharging myself with electric-type energy. Ever since then, I've been trying to reproduce it consistently. Buizel suddenly leaned across the table, his eyes practically sparkling. Could you teach me? Speed is my whole fighting style. I need that move. So shameless. Absol shook his head. No, he's right. Both Pokémon looked at me. I shouldn't keep something like that to myself. I smiled. You're welcome to learn it too. Absol blinked. Really? Who knows? I shrugged. It might get one of you out of a sticky situation someday. The white Pokémon stared at me for another moment. Most Pokémon keep their strongest techniques to themselves. I know. I flicked my tail with a grin. I'm not most Pokémon. That earned a quiet snort from Absol and an excited wag from Buizel. The rest of lunch passed with nearly half the class's Pokémon gathered around one table, enthusiastically discussing the morning's battles, arguing over strategies, and occasionally reenacting particularly impressive moments with far more dramatic flair than had actually happened. Olivia Haxon sat alone at one of the cafeteria tables, barely touching the food on her plate. She had started last year with no small amount of envy toward Ventis. The prince had seemed to gravitate toward the purple-haired mage whenever the opportunity presented itself, and Olivia would be lying if she said it hadn't bothered her. It had been childish. After all, Ventis was already married. It wasn't as though she was trying to steal Augustin away. No. Ventis had never done anything to deserve her resentment. If anything, she had always treated her with courtesy. Then winter had come. Olivia had been about to enter her father's office when she heard another voice inside. Proper etiquette dictated that she should quietly leave and return once the meeting had ended. Instead, curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer to the door. What she overheard froze the blood in her veins. The father she had always known, the gentleman who smiled warmly at his family, patiently listened to her worries, and treated guests with impeccable courtesy, was gone. The man speaking inside that office was cold, detached. He spoke of Lady Ventis Balatoa's death as though discussing an inconvenient ledger that needed balancing. She was politically troublesome. An assassin would solve that. Those few sentences had shattered the image Olivia had carried of her father for her entire life. More than once, she had sat at her desk, pen in hand, determined to write to Ventis. Every attempt ended the same way. She would stare at the page. Dear Lady Balatoa, my father intends to have you murdered. She could never make the words sound believable or sane. Each letter ended up torn into tiny pieces before ever leaving her room. And so, she had done nothing. When Ventis had walked into the assembly hall that morning, alive and smiling, the enormous weight crushing Olivia's chest had finally eased. Yet the guilt remained. She could have warned her. Somehow, anything would have been better than silence. Ventis wasn't the noble Olivia had imagined a year ago. She wasn't manipulative or ambitious. She simply made people smile. Even Olivia had found herself doing so more than once. Chimecho. Olivia let out a quiet sigh. What should I do? Chime? The floating Pokémon looked up from its lunch with mild curiosity. Finding no obvious answer to the question and little interest in complicated human worries, it gave a tiny shrug before returning to its meal. Thanks. You are great at helping, she sighed. With the students dismissed for the day, the five of us made our way toward the academy's outer training grounds. Just like previous year, I led the group with Noctowl gliding overhead, while Jolteon and Primarina chatted quietly behind me. Feraligatr followed at a relaxed pace, more bodyguard than instructor. His job was simply to make sure none of us managed to accidentally kill ourselves during training. Same routine? Jolteon asked. Same routine, I nodded. Within minutes we had finished strapping on our training weights. Heavy weights in leather wrapped around our wrists, ankles, tails, and waists. They had become so familiar over the past year that I barely noticed them anymore. All right. I rolled my shoulders. 3 laps to start. A large shadow swept across the field. We all looked up. Corviknight descended from the sky, landing with practiced elegance a short distance away. Headmaster Glacier's Corviknight? I asked. Before anyone could wonder why she was here, another Pokémon hopped lightly from her back. A neatly groomed Cinccino dusted off her paws before offering us a pleasant smile. Corviknight inclined her head. The headmaster has requested that Lady Cinccino and I oversee your afternoon training from today onward. The 5 of us exchanged puzzled looks. Us? Primarina asked. Corviknight nodded once. Precisely. I scratched behind one ear. I appreciate the thought, but why? The headmaster believes your current routine has reached the point where specialized guidance would be beneficial. Before I could ask another question, Cinccino clapped her paws together. Let's begin. A violet aura burst outward. Gravity. The world suddenly became impossibly heavy. My knees slammed into the ground before I even realized what had happened. The weights strapped across my body suddenly felt like they had multiplied several times over. Beside me, Jolteon hit the grass with a yelp. Primarina collapsed onto her stomach. Noctowl dropped from the air like a rock, landing in a thoroughly undignified heap. Feraligatr stumbled forward a bit, but with no weight on him, he managed. Only Corviknight and Cinccino remained standing effortlessly. "Well," Corviknight murmured quietly to herself as she examined the thick iron bands strapped to each of us. "I think we should have asked them to take off the weights." Cinccino blinked. "Should I release gravity?" "Yes." The crushing force vanished. Every one of us took a deep breath. I slowly pushed myself upright before immediately beginning to unbuckle the weights from my arms. "You know," I huffed, "that was rude as hell." The others quickly nodded and copied me. One by one, weights landed on the grass with heavy metallic thuds, making far louder sounds and deeper dips into the ground than any of the headmaster's Pokémon expected. Corviknight's eyes widened ever so slightly. "That is considerably more than I expected." Feraligatr chuckled as he just enjoyed the show. "I've been telling them they're crazy for months." "They're disciplined," Corviknight corrected. She turned towards Cinccino. Again, gravity returned. This time, compared to my nearly 300-pound torture weights, it actually felt rather pleasant. "This is actually quite nice," Jolteon said with a grin. "Way less restrictive than wearing all that metal." He immediately broke into a run within the field of heightened gravity as though it barely affected him. Noctowl gave an approving nod. "I have to agree. Weights are a nuisance." He took to the air, executing a series of tight turns without much difficulty. "I suppose I can't complain either." Primarina smiled as she began practicing her evasive maneuvers beneath the increased gravity. "They're actually doing it." Corviknight nodded thoughtfully. "They are this relaxed under my gravity?" Cinccino asked, stunned. Her gaze lingered on the pile of discarded iron lying beside the field. Just how much have they been carrying every day? For the first time since arriving, a small smile crossed Corviknight's beak. "I believe Headmaster Glacier was right," she looked toward us. "This training has only just begun." With the gravity still pressing down on us, I readjusted my training weights. The lightest set mere 10-pound bands went onto my wrists and ankles. Cinccino watched in stunned silence. I could almost see her questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. Still, it wasn't enough. My own body was simply too light. Even under the enhanced gravity, I needed additional weight before the training felt truly effective. By the end of the session, every one of us was exhausted. Unfortunately, Corviknight and Cinccino could only join us on the days they were free, which was far less often than I would have liked. Still, even occasional gravity training was better than none. By the time we returned home, the smell of dinner drifted from the kitchen. Miraculously, a tiny bit of energy returned to our bodies, just enough to reach the table. Robert looked over our thoroughly worn-out group with raised eyebrows. "Rough day?" Ventis let out an amused sigh. "Most mages have to order their Pokémon to train." She gestured toward us. "I have to stop mine from accidentally killing themselves." "Breaks." I folded my arms and gave an indignant huff. The room erupted into laughter. Dinner was warm, light, and exactly what our aching muscles needed. By the time the plates were empty, even lifting my arms felt like a chore. Not long afterward, we all retreated to our beds. Honestly, one of the best things about serious training was that falling asleep became effortless. Lying there, I found myself thinking back to my old life. I used to look down on gym bros. In my mind, they had all been loud, annoying meatheads obsessed with lifting heavy things for no reason. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment before letting out a quiet sigh. Well, I guess I was wrong. Sleep claimed me almost immediately. That night, I dreamed of increasingly muscular Mareep calmly jumping over a fence. Viscount Ormond Trevai leisurely swirled a goblet of white wine, watching the pale liquid catch the afternoon light. Officially, importing Jiao Sharan wine was forbidden. Officially, he took another satisfied sip. Last year's attempt to capture the Brazian had failed, but only because the information he had received was incomplete. Fortunately, he had been cautious enough to work through 2 separate intermediaries before the kidnapper was hired. Even if the trail were somehow uncovered, it would never lead back to him. We need an opportunity to seize both the mage and her Pokémon, Solomon. A pleased smile spread across his face. Jaushara has already promised to elevate my standing once the war is over. But if I personally return one of their sacred royal Pokémon, his smile widened, they will have no choice but to reward me handsomely. Naturally, my lord. Solomon bowed deeply. Your foresight knows no equal. No need to grovel, Ormond replied with a slight frown. Just tell me, are the anti-magic cuffs ready? They are. And the collar? Solomon straightened slightly. Completed, tested, and improved. Improved? We learned from last year's mistake. A trace of pride crept into the hunchback's voice. This time the restriction collar functions exactly as intended. We tested it on several Pokémon before removing them. Ormond raised an eyebrow. And we made certain they wished to escape. The advisor spoke those words with chilling calm. They struggled. They fought. Some were even encouraged to resist. His expression never changed. None succeeded. A satisfied nod escaped the Viscount. Excellent. He took another sip of wine. The enchanter? Still alive. Solomon allowed himself a faint smile. I suspected you might require his talents again, so I ensured he survived his punishment. 20 lashes were sufficient to make an example of him, but not enough to kill him. He has remained in the prison ever since. You planned ahead. I merely anticipated your needs, my lord. For the first time that afternoon, genuine approval appeared on Ormond's face. Good. He set the goblet onto the table with a quiet click. Now all we require is the proper opportunity. Solomon bowed once more. It will come. As he quietly left the room, a small smile lingered on his lips. He had spent years serving Viscount Trevai. The man was many things vain, ruthless, and utterly single-minded, but one quality had always impressed Solomon. Once Ormond desired something, he rarely stopped until it belonged to him. The enchantment class with Professor Jane Orisha finally reached a subject Ventis genuinely enjoyed. Everyday enchantments. Instead of focusing on weapons or magical tools, today's lecture revolved around the comforts of daily life. Self-filling inkwells, pens that wrote as their owner dictated, chairs that obeyed simple commands without relying on levitation, carpets capable of carrying their owners through the air, enchanted lamps that adjusted their own brightness. Any self-respecting mage with enough coin would own at least a few such conveniences. Not a single student made a sound. All 10 listened with complete attention. Even I had to admit, this looked fun. Since I couldn't use human magic anyway, I usually spent these classes reading or quietly studying whatever books Ventis had brought along. Today, however, inspiration struck. Borrowing one of Ventis's spare writing sets, I began sketching my own enchantment diagram. A tea set. One that gently heated the liquid inside the kettle and, with a specific finger gesture made nearby, would lift itself, pour the tea into waiting cups, and return without spilling a single drop. The more I thought about it, the more refinements I added. Temperature regulation, overflow prevention, automatic shutoff, precise pouring angles. By the time Professor Orisia dismissed the class, the page was covered in neat notes and magical circles. "Bry, Breakson." I hurried over and held the paper up to her. Jane looked away from the book she was packing. "I noticed you were writing something throughout the lesson. What is?" She accepted the page. "This?" Her eyes slowly widened. Ventis, who had stopped beside me, leaned over to look. "What is it?" Jane lowered the paper for a moment before looking directly at Ventis. Did your Breakson really design this? Ventis smiled awkwardly. Fenn is something of my study partner. Professor Orisha looked back at the diagram. This is remarkable. Her finger traced several of the interconnected enchantment circles. It's surprisingly close to an enchantment I designed years ago. She paused. There are differences, of course. A few of these solutions are actually rather clever. She looked back up with an intrigued smile. I'll construct a prototype and test it. If it functions exactly as it's written here, I'll happily award both of you bonus marks. Really? Ventis's eyes lit up. Only then did she take a proper look at the drawing herself. A self-heating, self-pouring tea kettle. She laughed. If it works, may I have a copy of the enchantment? I simply grinned and gave her a confident thumbs up. Both defensive magic and offensive magic had changed dramatically from the previous year. Professor William Dawnmore no longer taught from behind a desk. He became the lesson. The veteran mage attacked every student personally, his spells precise, relentless, and carrying just enough force to expose every weakness without causing actual injury. The Academy's protective amulets did their job well, but that did little to spare anyone's pride. By the end of the lesson, nearly everyone had tasted dirt at least once. Prince Augustine performed the best. He combined quick footwork with defensive casting, constantly repositioning instead of standing his ground. It delayed the inevitable, but eventually even he found himself flat on his back after one particularly well-placed spell slipped through his defenses. Ventis, meanwhile, only hit the ground once. Not because she was faster, simply because she defended differently. Instead of relying on a single barrier, she layered multiple shields together while angling them to deflect incoming attacks. It was an idea I had borrowed from tank armor. A flat wall absorbed the full impact. A slanted one redirected much of the force instead. Against concentrated attacks like ice shards or volleys of rock pellets, the difference was remarkable. Unfortunately, explosive spells didn't care. They simply detonated on contact, tearing through every layer at once. One fire burst later, Ventis was sitting in the grass with a sheepish smile. "You really need to join us for cardio," I said, offering her a hand. She accepted it with an exaggerated sigh. Professor Zeke Clash's class brought an entirely different surprise. Before the practical battles even began, he motioned Ventis toward him. "I'm afraid you won't be dueling the other students today." Ventis blinked. "Why?" Zeke answered by silently pointing toward a section of the training wall. Although it had long since been repaired, everyone present remembered exactly what had happened there the previous year. Realization slowly dawned on Ventis. "Oh? If you want a spell duel," Zeke said, slipping 2 protective rings onto his fingers, "I'll be your opponent." Despite his confident smile, I could practically smell the mixture of excitement and apprehension radiating from him. The duel began. Then ended explosively. Then it began again. Twice during the exercise, Zeke abruptly called for a pause so the enchantments within his defensive rings could recover after absorbing Ventis's spells. By the second break, he rubbed the back of his neck and laughed awkwardly. "Girl, I don't think I'm the right training partner for you anymore." He let out a slow breath. "Don't worry. I'll ask around and find someone who—" A powerful gust of wind swept across the training grounds. Every head turned upward. A massive salamence descended gracefully from the sky before landing beyond the practice field. Seated upon its back was a man every student immediately recognized. Archmage Gehatu. "I will oversee Lady Balatoa's practical offensive training." His calm voice carried effortlessly across the field. He looked directly at Ventis. "From tomorrow I shall collect you when Professor Clash start his class. We will train at my estate." Silence followed. Then, so quietly that he clearly thought no one would hear him, Zeke whispered, "Thank the stars. I heard it anyway." The man was one of Vermont's royal war mages, and Ventis had managed to intimidate him. That alone spoke volumes. Still, it made perfect sense. Magic was, at its core, an extension of the natural laws governing the world. The better you understood those laws, the less magical energy you wasted forcing reality to obey you. Thanks to the scientific knowledge I'd carried over from Earth, Ventis wasn't simply casting stronger spells. She was casting smarter ones. In practical terms, it was almost like multiplying the effectiveness of every spell by 3. Just like that, the following day we were excused from Professor Clash's attack class. Salamence carried us through the sky until we landed in Archmage Gehatu's personal training yard. The old mage looked like a man watching 1,000,000 gold coins rain from the heavens. His eyes glittered with excitement, and he even rubbed his palms together. "I am so glad I finally get to teach you personally." He chuckled. "The king didn't want me to, but now I finally had the perfect comeback." He cleared his throat dramatically before putting on an exaggeratedly pitiful expression. "Your Majesty." Lady Balatoa might accidentally destroy the poor teacher. The act lasted only a second before he burst into laughter. "Now!" he shouted, spreading his arms wide. "Hit me with your best shot." "Are you sure, Master Gehatu?" Ventis asked, fully aware that her best shot was capable of destroying military-grade barriers. "Did I stutter?" Gehatu shook his head. "I am an archmage. Strongest spell you can cast. Hold nothing back." Ventis carefully looked at me. "Hey?" he asked for it. I gave her a thumbs up. "Use as much of my power as you need." "Okay, here it goes." She decided to use the element most natural to her, fire. Through our bond, I pushed nearly half of my full magical reserves into her. Almost immediately, a massive sphere of blue fire formed before her. It continued growing until nearly half of our side of the training yard was bathed in its brilliant light. Then, she fired. I winced as the enormous amount of mana left my body, and beside me I saw Ventis stagger from the strain. Boom! An explosion unlike anything either of us had ever experienced erupted across the training yard. The blast wave raced toward us. Without thinking, I jumped in front of Ventis and threw up 2 barriers. Both shattered instantly. The remaining 4 slammed us into the stone wall behind us. For several long moments, smoke covered everything. Then a figure slowly emerged. There stood Gehatu. His eyes were as wide as saucers. The edges of his mage's robes were gently smoldering, and the once pristine cover of his focus book had turned a crispy shade of black. Around him, the segmented layers of his magical shield slowly cracked apart before dissolving into motes of mana. "Damn, girl!" He gave himself a quick shake before dusting soot from his shoulders. "That could have destroyed a magically enhanced fortress wall. Yay!" Ventis weakly raised one hand, then promptly passed out. Thankfully, she was already sitting on the ground. A moment later, nearly 50 armed Aura Knights burst into the garden with swords drawn. At their head marched the commander, accompanied by a Machamp clad in full plate armor, each of its 4 arms carrying a massive claymore. Before anyone could jump to the wrong conclusion, Gehatu immediately raised a hand. "No worries. It was just a magic test," he called out. The commander looked from the enormous crater to the lingering smoke, then back to the Archmage. "Just what kind of magic test makes the ground shake half a mile away?" he asked, stomping toward him. It took Ventis nearly an hour to wake up. By then, we had already missed our next class, though considering the explosion, I doubted anyone at the academy had managed to continue teaching uninterrupted anyway. Even from this distance, they must have heard and probably felt it. The damage itself was expensive. Our little magic test had shattered nearly 100 windows throughout the royal castle, and several dozen more in the surrounding noble manors. Thankfully, it was Gehatu who had to pay for everything. "I really don't want to know how much the Archmage was charged," Ventis winced. judging by the way Gehatu had simply shrugged before signing the bill. However, he didn't seem particularly heartbroken. "How are you feeling?" I asked, helping her to her feet, though I could sense it myself. She swayed slightly. "Honestly," she shuddered, "like a dried-up raisin. I used almost 90% of my mana in one go. I think I even strained my mana roots." "Ouch." She grabbed the top of her head. "Why did you hit me?" "Because you overdid it. Again." I frowned. "The Archmage asked for it." "Ouch." This time she instinctively raised a hand to shield her head before I could give her another chop. "If someone asked you to jump into the mouth of a Gyarados, would you do that too?" I huffed. "I expected you to use 70% of your mana at most." I folded my arms. "You nearly caused permanent damage to yourself." I could feel my face growing hotter by the second. Whether from anger or worry, even I wasn't sure anymore. "Please stop hitting my student." Gehatu leaned toward me, his smile completely gone. "I need her mind to remain intact." He spoke quietly, almost gently. Yet somehow that calm voice made my spine do a roller coaster of cold running up and down. "Breaks?" I immediately bowed in apology. His cheerful expression returned as though it had never left. "Good." He looked toward Ventis. "Since you've already missed your next class, you might as well remain here." He offered her a hand and helped her toward the tower. "I have a restorative potion that should get you back on your feet in no time." I let out a quiet sigh before following the two of them. With limits tested and lessons learned, 2 weeks slowly rolled by. I enjoyed my Saiyan-style training whenever Cinchino was around. On the other days, I trained normally with my team. To my surprise, a few of the other students' Pokémon eventually began joining us. Apparently, after Ventis did her thing, several students decided to double down on their own training. Their competitive nature got the better of them, and they started sending their Pokémon to train alongside us. Buizel always arrived with a grin stretching from ear to ear. Ducklet looked like she was walking to her own execution. Absol maintained his usual noble bearing. Mostly. That composure lasted only until he strapped on the weights, at which point even he wore a thoroughly stunned expression. Every afternoon we trained, until we could barely lift another leg. Only then did we remove the weights, rest for a few minutes, and drag ourselves back home. Eventually, we stopped carrying the weights back altogether. No one was crazy enough to steal them, and the overhanging walkway protected them from the rain well enough. "I think I'm nearly there," Jolteon muttered as he collapsed onto his favorite rug. "Nearly where?" Primarina asked. "Extreme speed." Jolteon grinned. "No way." I turned my head so quickly that my shoulder immediately protested with a sharp stab of pain. I winced, but looked at him anyway. "When did you start learning it?" Jolteon let out a tired laugh. "The same day you did, more or less." He flashed me a toothy grin. "You didn't think I'd let you leave me in the dust, did you? I'll beat you one day." "Dream on," I answered with a grin of my own. A moment later, we were both laughing. "I honestly hate all of you," Noctowl muttered, shaking his head. "You're a bunch of idiots." "I know you love us." Primarina flicked a few drops of water onto him. Noctowl instinctively puffed up every feather on his body. The sight was so ridiculous that all 4 of us burst into laughter. At the quarter-year examinations, the second and third-year students received an announcement that immediately captured everyone's attention. Their half-year practical examination would not take place at the academy. Instead, they would travel to the barracks, along Vermont's second defensive line. There, each student would be placed in command of a military unit consisting of roughly 80 foot soldiers and 20 knights. Under the supervision of experienced officers, they would spend several days learning the fundamentals of battlefield command in a real military environment. Of course, this wasn't the border itself, as an entire barony still lay between the barracks and Jaushara. Should anything happen, The students could easily be evacuated back to the capital long before danger ever reached them. Besides, no one seriously believed Zhao Shara would dare attack. It had been 7 years since the last war, and according to every report reaching the capital, the neighboring kingdom was still licking its wounds. Commanding an entire unit? Ventis leaned back in her chair. That's 80 foot soldiers and 20 knights. Her face gradually paled. I don't know if I can do that. Oh. I reached over and patted her on the head. You'll be fine. Stage fright is perfectly normal. I puffed out my chest. Just act like me. She gave me a thoroughly unimpressed look. Like you? Yes. Shouting at everyone and acting overly confident isn't exactly my forte. She shook her head. Then why not learn? I cleared my throat and switched to my deepest inner commanding voice. Steady. I wanted this formation in order yesterday. I couldn't help snickering. See? Just like that. Smack. Ventis lightly slapped the top of my head. Don't shout inside my mind, you dummy. Despite herself, she let out a small laugh. Uh-huh. I pointed finger guns at her. I cracked you up. Fine. She sighed dramatically. Not like I wanted to. For the next 2 days, I left the afternoon training to the others. Instead, I focused on coaching Ventis. How to stand, how to project confidence, how to give clear, concise orders, how to sound like someone soldiers would instinctively obey. Her voice remained far too gentle for my liking, but she tried. Emphasis on tried. Thankfully, life wasn't all studying and training. Throughout the school year, there had been plenty of birthday parties, noble balls, tea gatherings, and other social events, all of which Ventis and I enjoyed in our own ways. Since Robert was so devoted to his books, those occasions were usually when he and Ventis spent the most time together. I was honestly stunned that the boy could still focus primarily on studying and sword training when he had someone like Ventis waiting for him. Of course, Ventis refused to let him spend every waking hour buried in books. Several times each month she practically dragged him out of his room so they could stroll through the streets of the capital with their guards. Other than that, however, they seemed perfectly content doing their own things. It was honestly confusing. In public, they would cling to one another, chatting happily and looking like the perfect young couple. Then they would return home, disappear into separate rooms, and bury themselves in books for hours. I suppose they were simply meant for one another. Over those months, I also became good friends with Weasel and Absol. Ducklet, of course, still considered me an uncivilized brute, but all the training and our many battles gradually changed her opinion. More importantly, she no longer lagged behind during our physical training. Then it finally happened. After winning a hard-fought battle against Buizel, Ducklet was suddenly engulfed in a brilliant white glow. When the light faded, she had evolved into a swanna. Instantly, I became her best friend. Marianne was so overjoyed that she threw an evolution banquet in Swanna's honor, and every one of us received an invitation. The Pokémon-themed celebration was wonderful. I even received a new decorative bow as a gift, which, admittedly, made me rather happy. Not that I didn't already own around 60 of them. Slowly, the middle of summer arrived, bringing with it the usual heat wave. The half-year examinations were now only a week away. The academy courtyard had never been this crowded before. Rows upon rows of Pokémon-drawn carriages filled the open grounds, their polished wood gleaming beneath the morning sun. Supply wagons stood between them, already loaded with food, spare equipment, tents, medicine, and enough provisions to sustain the entire expedition for weeks. Nearly 200 soldiers busied themselves with final preparations. Some checked harnesses, others counted crates. Knights inspected weapons while stable hands calmed restless Pokémon hitched to the heavier wagons. The whole academy seemed alive. "This is for us?" Ventis asked quietly. I looked over the enormous caravan. I suppose commanding an army unit means they don't exactly want us walking there. One by one, the students arrived with their entourages. Unlike previous academy events, the one Pokémon rule no longer applied. Every noble family had taken the opportunity to send the rest of their young Pokémon along. Most were still unevolved or only recently evolved, hardly suited for real combat, but the coming exercises would let them experience military life alongside their partners. The courtyard quickly filled with curious cries, excited conversations, and the occasional playful chase as younger Pokémon met one another for the first time. Even I had to admit, the atmosphere was contagious. Near the front of the formation stood 3 familiar professors. Professor William Dawnmore wore light field armor over his academy uniform, looking every bit the veteran officer he truly was. Professor Zeke Clash seemed positively energized, enthusiastically talking with several officers while Ampharos stood proudly beside him. Knight Professor Garrick Stonewall. Unlike the other instructors, he wore full plate armor, polished to a mirror shine. His enormous shield rested casually against one shoulder, as though it weighed nothing at all. "He looks exactly like I imagined," I muttered. A loud trumpet sounded from the front of the caravan. Several royal banners appeared beyond the academy gates. "The Royal Guard," one of the servants whispered. It made perfect sense as Prince Augustine was traveling with us. A dozen of the king's own elite knights rode into the courtyard, their armor bearing the crest of House Vermont. Unlike ordinary escorts, every movement they made carried quiet confidence born from years of experience. Their commander exchanged a few words with Professor Dawnmore before taking position near the prince's carriage. Just then, a familiar shadow circled overhead. A Pidgeotto descended gracefully before landing beside Ventis. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten about me," the bird said with a friendly smile to me. "Pidgeotto!" Ventis brightened immediately. "Master Gehatu asked me to accompany you." He puffed out his chest with obvious pride. "He said if you're going to spend 2 weeks near soldiers, someone should make sure you don't accidentally level the barracks." I snorted. "Sounds like him." The Pidgeotto gave a small nod. "He also said I'm to continue your practical lessons whenever the opportunity presents itself." "Wonderful." Ventis smiled as I relayed what Pidgeotto said, though there was just the slightest hint of nervousness in her voice. Another horn echoed across the courtyard. Drivers climbed onto their benches. Soldiers formed marching columns around the wagons. The professors mounted their own Pokémon, while servants hurried to their assigned places. At the very front, Professor Dawnmore raised one hand. "Caravan!" The conversations gradually faded. "Move out!" With the creak of wheels and the rhythmic clatter of hooves against stone, the long procession rolled through the academy gates. Ahead of them lay nearly 2 weeks of travel, and the rear army barracks that would serve as the stage for their half-year examinations. The journey to the rear barracks turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable. For one, I suddenly had dozens of new Pokémon to talk to. Every noble had brought along the rest of their team, and it was fascinating hearing stories from Pokémon raised in different parts of Vermont. The scenery helped too. The eastern side of the kingdom was beautiful, dotted with crystal-clear lakes nestled between rolling green hills. Dense forests stretched for miles, occasionally broken by small farming villages or grazing fields where Mareep, Tauros, and Miltank peacefully wandered under the watchful eyes of shepherds. There was only one delay during the entire journey: a graveler migration. The caravan came to a halt as hundreds of the rock-type Pokémon slowly crossed the main road, making their way from one mountain range to another. Thankfully, they were in no mood for trouble. The procession merely waited until the last graveler had rumbled into the nearby hills before continuing onward. As we drew closer to our destination, I couldn't help rolling my eyes. They called this some barracks? Ahead of us stood an absolutely enormous fortress. Even from a distance, I could already see young soldiers running laps around its outer walls, while groups of Pokémon trained alongside them as part of the morning exercises. As for the fortress itself, it dwarfed anything I had expected. The place was easily larger than a football stadium. A thick curtain wall protected the front, complete with towers, battlements, and several layers of defensive fortifications designed to slow any advancing army. Beyond those walls lay a vast inner courtyard bustling with activity. Rows of barracks housed the soldiers. A large smithy rang with the sound of hammers striking steel. Warehouses overflowed with supplies, while stables, training grounds, kitchens, workshops, and command buildings filled the remaining space. This wasn't merely a place for soldiers to sleep. It was an entire military town built around a fortress, capable of housing thousands of men should the need ever arise. The moment the caravan reached the fortress, the atmosphere changed completely. The relaxed conversations died down as the massive gates slowly creaked open. Dozens of guards stood watch atop the walls while knights patrolled the battlements. Inside, soldiers marched in orderly formations between the buildings, their synchronized footsteps echoing across the courtyard. Everywhere I looked, people had something to do. No one wandered aimlessly. No one stood around chatting. This place lived and breathed discipline. Our caravan rolled through the main gate and into the enormous courtyard before finally coming to a halt. A broad-shouldered knight wearing the insignia of a colonel stepped forward. "Welcome to Eastwatch Fortress." His voice carried effortlessly over the bustling courtyard. "For the next 2 weeks, this fortress will serve as both your home and your classroom." He looked over the assembled students. "Today is reserved for settling in. You will not receive your military assignments until tomorrow morning." I noticed several students quietly relax at that announcement. You are free to familiarize yourselves with the fortress after unpacking. However, the outer walls, command center, armory, and supply depots remain off-limits unless accompanied by an officer. He nodded toward one of the largest buildings near the rear wall. "Your accommodations have already been prepared." Compared to the practical military buildings surrounding it, the structure almost looked like a noble's inn. 3 stories tall with white stone walls and polished wooden balconies, it stood in stark contrast to the otherwise rugged fortress. Flower boxes decorated the windows, and even the entrance had been carefully maintained. "That looks more like a hotel than military housing," I muttered. "It probably has to." Ventis smiled. Nobles aren't exactly used to sleeping in barracks. Servants quickly began unloading luggage, while several soldiers guided each student toward their assigned room. Ventis received a brass key with the number 27 engraved upon it. After climbing 2 flights of stairs, we found our room waiting. It was cozy. 2 proper beds stood against opposite walls, while a comfortable rug covered most of the wooden floor. A writing desk occupied one corner beside a bookshelf, and a wardrobe stood opposite it. There was even a private washroom, which honestly surprised me. Then all of us walked inside. "This might be a little cramped," Ventis admitted. She wasn't wrong. With me, Jolteon, Primarina, and Noctowl all sharing the room alongside her, the available space disappeared rather quickly. Jolteon looked around before laughing. "Well, at least nobody will be lonely." Primarina slipped into the brass tub and used water gun to fill it. "I've certainly had worse." Noctowl flew onto the wardrobe without a word. I called the high ground. I looked around once more before nodding. "It'll do. Much bigger than the room in Hagsrot." Ventis chuckled, remembering that ratata hole of a room. With most of our belongings staying in out suitcases and me having nothing to do, I shrugged and simply used the window to jump out. While the others were busy settling into their rooms, I decided to explore the fortress. The difference between this place and the capital was immediate. Soldiers looked at me with visible hostility. Some stopped their conversations altogether while I walked past. Others followed me with their eyes, hands never straying far from their weapons. Thankfully, my military-issued armband and badge did their job. The crest of House Balatoa embroidered upon them told everyone exactly who I belonged to. Without them, I had little doubt someone would have already tried to chase me out of the fortress. I never thought I'd live to see a Brakeson serving on our side. The familiar booming laugh made me turn around. The same colonel who had welcomed us into the fortress strode toward me, hands resting comfortably behind his back. Name's Colonel Grebe Hurricane. He extended a hand before realizing halfway through that I didn't exactly shake hands. I've heard from several sources that you're a fair bit smarter than the average Pokémon. I pulled my slate from my tail fluff and quickly wrote a reply. I do my best, sir. The colonel raised an eyebrow. Well now, he scratched his beard. Using military etiquette, he chuckled. Were you trained by knights? I shook my head before writing again. Self-taught, sir, though I'm tougher than a Raiden. I proudly thumped a fist against my chest. Grebe burst into laughter. I like you already. His grin widened. So then, does your master allow you to battle? He tapped the crystal Pokeball hanging from his belt. I'd love to see what you can do. I tucked my slate away. I've only fought one military Pokémon before. Count Evelna's Umbreon. I smiled. But I'm always happy to accept a challenge. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. That Umbreon was a real menace in the last What. If not for that Charizard, he would still be one of the best. The colonel turned on his heel. Come with me. He led me to one of the fortress's larger training grounds, where two military Pokémon were just finishing a mock battle beneath the watchful eyes of several officers and battle mages. The moment they stepped off the field, Grebe walked into the center. All right. His voice echoed across the yard. I want everyone's attention. Conversations ceased almost instantly. With a practiced motion, he unclipped the crystal Pokeball from his belt. A flash of white light erupted. A Flygon landed gracefully before him, its emerald wings humming softly. Busy, the colonel rested a hand on her neck. Mock battle. He pointed toward me. That's your training partner. Flygon slowly turned her head. Our eyes met. The look she gave me made my fur stand on end. It wasn't simply competitiveness, raw, unmistakable hostility, not the overwhelming killing intent I'd felt from Magmar, but close enough that every instinct in my body immediately recognized it. Before we start, I raised a paw, making sure the colonel saw I wanted a moment before speaking to Flygon. I can feel that you hate me, and I have a pretty good idea it's because I'm a Braixen. Could you please not think of me as the enemy king's Pokémon, but as someone who grew up here and hasn't done anything wrong? Flygon stared at me for a moment before her expression turned awkward. Right. She looked away for a second. Sorry, I've fought against fire types so many times that the feeling comes by instinct. She met my eyes again. I'll try to be objective. That's all I can ask. I nodded before taking my position on the opposite side of the training field. I don't think I'll interfere, Colonel Grebe said as he stepped aside. You don't have your mage with you either. He drew his longsword, raised it high, then brought it down in one clean motion. Begin! The battle exploded into motion. Flygon reached me in less than a second. Only my experience fighting Umbreon saved me. I bent backwards as far as physically possible, using my tail to stop myself from falling before spinning into a fire spin, hoping to create both distance and a counterattack. As soon as I looked up, Flygon was gone. A heartbeat later, something slammed into my back. Fly. The attack sent me tumbling across the training field. I really need to take this seriously. I gritted my teeth. I was pretty sure one of my teeth had just come loose. She never let up. Dragon Claw, Dragon Tail, Dig, even Bite. The relentless assault left me with almost no room to retaliate. Every second was spent dodging or barely turning direct hits into glancing blows. Finally, extreme speed. The world slowed. Then, Thunder Punch. My fist connected squarely with Flygon's stomach, electricity crackling violently across her scales as she was finally knocked backward. I hadn't held back. Granted, I also hadn't borrowed any power from Ventis. Even so, Flygon merely looked down at the smoking paw print on her stomach. Then she casually brushed away a bit of dirt. Huh. Right. I clenched my jaw. ground and dragon. Electricity was barely more than a gentle breeze to her. Then an idea crossed my mind. One I wasn't entirely sure was smart. I activated Flame Charge and layered Extreme Speed on top of it. For a brief instant, I broke the sound barrier. The impact shook the entire training field. Flygon was launched several meters backward. I wasn't nearly as fortunate. The moment I hit her, I felt several ribs crack. Both of my legs instantly seized with cramping as though every muscle had decided to fail at once, and I rolled helplessly across the dirt before finally coming to a stop. Every breath felt like someone was pushing needles into my chest. Flygon landed beside me. Dummy, she sighed before lightly bonking me on the head. What in the world did you just do? Combined? Moves? I answered with a pained grin. There is a reason attacks like those aren't combined. She shook her head. You'll destroy your own body before your opponent. She bonked my head again. Hey, I groaned. My head already hurts. Reaching into the fluffy fur of my tail, I pulled out a revive stone. Unlike the games from my old world, these weren't just for waking unconscious Pokémon. They were concentrated life energy. A miracle in crystal form. I bit down. Crack. Warm energy flooded through my body. It wasn't an instant cure. The broken ribs still hurt, and my muscles were still damaged. But the pain dulled dramatically as my body shifted into overdrive, pouring everything it had into recovery. Whoa! Colonel Grebe stared at me. Just how wealthy is your master if you can chew through a revive stone like it's candy? I pulled out my slate and quickly wrote, She has her own mining team. With a grin, I reached into my tail again. 1, 2, 3. 4 more revive stones appeared in my paw. The colonel blinked. Flygon blinked. Half the soldiers watching the battle looked ready to faint. Still grinning, I tucked the stones safely back into my tail fluff. I dusted myself off and felt my ribs slowly knit themselves back together. Pokémon recovery was honestly broken. Powered by a revive stone, the body's natural healing became monstrous. It wasn't instant, but the difference was absurd. My cracked ribs were already reconnecting, and the cramps in my legs faded with every passing second. For a brief moment, I wanted to crack some stupid joke like a certain merc with a mouth. Instead, I simply walked back to my starting position, rolling my shoulders and flexing my legs. You can't be serious. Colonel Grebe raised an eyebrow. You want to fight again? Flygon asked. Aren't you tired? Who do I look like? I smirked. Some pampered noble fluffball? I rolled one shoulder again. My body was already returning to something resembling factory settings. The colonel simply laughed before raising his sword once more. Fight? This time, I attacked first. Extreme speed. The distance vanished instantly. Psyshock. The psychic blast erupted almost point blank, forcing Flygon to react instead of attack. Before the dust had even settled, I slipped around her dragon claw and immediately chained the movement into another extreme speed. Fire blast! The blazing attack slammed into her back. Of course, that attack turned into an exchange as I ate an iron tail with my face, sending me into the dirt. Good reflexes, I spat, climbing back to my feet. Flygon smiled. It's less about reflexes and more about instinct. She casually stretched one wing. And experience. You may be fast, but you're still predictable. I gritted my teeth. For another 2 minutes we fought without pause. I threw everything I had at her. By the end, I looked like a kicked puppy. My fur was covered in dirt, and several shallow cuts painted my arms and legs red. Flygon had a scorched patch on her side. And, for the first time, she was breathing a little harder. She looked at me with newfound respect. To push me this far, she exhaled. You're one crazy little Brasian. Her claws began glowing with draconic energy. I give! I shouted immediately. I'd rather not get knocked unconscious today. The glowing claws stopped barely an inch from my nose. Instead, she reached forward with one claw and gently poked me on the forehead. Only then did the spectators seem to remember how to breathe. "That," someone said, "was amazing. I can't believe that." One of the military mages slowly lowered his staff. "To think that's the Pokémon of a second-year student." A soldier shook his head in disbelief. "What kind of training produces something like that?" Colonel Grebe looked between Flygon and me before rubbing his chin. "Just what do you do to get this durable?" He tossed an orange berry toward me. I caught it and took a large bite before pulling out my slate. Weight training combined with gravity training. The colonel read the message twice. Gravity. He actually seemed to consider the idea before giving a thoughtful nod. "Huh." He tossed another orange berry toward Flygon. "Come on." He gestured for her to follow. "I need someone to look at that burn." Then he pointed at me. "And you." A grin spread across his face. "Get back to your master before she thinks we've killed you." I gave him a thumbs up before dragging myself back toward the noble quarters. When I finally pushed open the door to our room, Ventis was already waiting. Several bandages lay neatly arranged on the table beside a handful of medicine bottles. I simply walked over and collapsed face first onto the bed beside her. "Did you really have to challenge the strongest Pokémon in the entire base?" Ventis asked with a sigh as she spread another layer of salve over one of my cuts. "I was told you have to assert your dominance with authority," I chuckled, remembering an old joke from Earth. "Eek!" I shuddered as the ridiculously minty salve seeped into the fresh wounds. "Did you win?" Jolteon asked, leaning forward eagerly. I managed to get her winded, and a little crispy. I frowned. "That Flygon is a menace." "I don't know what you expected." Noctowl shook his head. "That's a military Pokémon, a fully evolved one at that. And she's probably got decades of training and real battles behind her." He looked at me over the top of one wing. "You've got, what, 2 years?" "Stuff it, Feathers," I grinned. "Or I'll use you as stuffing for my pillow." Eek! My tail puffed up like an antenna as Ventis wrapped another bandage around my side. "It's a good thing we have over 24 revived stones lying around." "Do not." Ventis poked me in the ribs, used them so casually. She fixed me with a stern look. "They're incredibly valuable and extremely rare. They're for emergencies only." "Yes, Mom." I rolled my eyes dramatically. She couldn't help but laugh. "I mean it." She stood, brushed off her skirt, and gathered the remaining medicine. "I'm going out for a little while." She pointed a finger at me. "Stay here." Then at the others. "And don't let her cause any trouble." Jolteon nodded, said with a grin. Ventis just shook her head, smiling as she walked out the door. The moment it closed, Jolteon practically bounced over to my bed. "All right," he sat down. "I want every single detail." So I told them everything. From Flygon's initial hostility, to her relentless attacks, to the moment I accidentally combined Flame Charge with extreme speed and nearly shattered my own ribs. Jolteon listened with sparkling eyes, asking question after question whenever I mentioned a particular move or opening. Primarina listened just as attentively, though unlike Jolteon, she never once asked how to fight Flygon herself. She simply seemed interested in hearing the story. The evening sun painted the fortress walls in shades of orange and gold. From atop the battlements, the view stretched for miles. Rolling hills slowly disappeared into distant forests, while patrols of soldiers marched below with practiced precision. Somewhere within the fortress, a blacksmith's hammer still rang against glowing steel. Ventis rested both hands on the stone parapet. "It's rater peaceful up here. It helps that we aren't the ones on patrol." Prince Augustine leaned against the wall beside her, his eyes following a squad of knights leaving through the main gate. "They'll be back before sunrise." Silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward. After 2 years at the academy, they had long grown comfortable in one another's company. Augustine glanced sideways. "You're worried." Ventis smiled weakly. Is it that obvious? You've been quieter than usual, ever since they told us we'd be commanding soldiers. She sighed. I suppose I have. For a while she simply watched the banners flutter in the evening breeze. Do you ever wonder if I aimed too high? Augustine raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I want to become a famous mage, she smiled softly. I really do. But when Gehatu keeps talking about becoming an archmage, she shook her head. That sounds like far too much responsibility. I don't know if someone like me should ever reach that position. Augustine remained quiet for a moment before answering. I think you should. She looked at him in surprise. You've already proven you have the talent. It isn't about talent, he noted. Ventis looked back toward the horizon. An archmage protects the kingdom, advise kings, oversee magical research. They're responsible for countless lives. She let out a quiet breath. I barely feel ready to command 100 soldiers. How could I ever become something like that? Augustine smiled gently. I've been asking myself a very similar question. That caught her attention. The second prince doesn't exactly expect to become king. He chuckled. Normally, no. He rested his forearms on the stone wall. My older brother has made it abundantly clear that he'd rather spend his life with the army than behind a desk signing documents. A hint of pride entered his voice. He was born to lead soldiers, but not a kingdom, or at least it's what he says. Augustine looked down into the courtyard where soldiers were changing shifts. So, that leaves me. Ventis blinked. You really think you'll become king? I think, he smiled ruefully. I need to prepare as though I will. If father decides my brother truly doesn't want the throne, then the responsibility will fall to me. He looked toward the fading sunset. That's a frightening thought. For all my confidence, I've never had to make decisions that could change thousands of lives. He laughed quietly. So if you're wondering whether you're ready to become an archmage, I'm wondering whether I'll ever be worthy of wearing a crown. Ventis couldn't help smiling. I never thought princes worried about things like that. We're people before we're princes, he shrugged. We just happen to wear nicer clothes. That earned a genuine laugh from Ventis. Augustine smiled. Besides, I've watched you for 2 years now. You work harder than almost anyone I know. You never stop learning, and whenever someone needs help, you're always the first to offer it. He met her eyes. If those aren't the qualities an archmage should have, then I honestly don't know what they are. Ventis felt her cheeks warm slightly. Thank you. I still don't know whether I can do it. You don't have to know, Augustine smiled. You just have to keep taking the next step. The two of them fell comfortably silent once more. Below, the fortress gradually lit its lanterns one by one as soldiers changed shifts and the evening watch took their places upon the walls. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed. Only when the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the western hills did they finally turn back toward the fortress. Night had quietly settled over the second defensive line. Several hundred meters from the fortress, atop a wooded hill overlooking the valley, 4 dark figures lay hidden among the undergrowth. Every one of them wore black travel garments with their faces covered by cloth masks. Even their rapidashes had been left deeper within the forest to avoid drawing attention. The fortress below was brightly illuminated despite the approaching night. There are too many soldiers, one of them muttered. That's why we're discussing it instead of rushing in, another replied. The first man clicked his tongue. Easy for you to say, Root. Enough, a woman interrupted quietly. We're here to plan. The others immediately fell silent. She was Mist, the leader. Blade shifted his weight and pointed toward the rear building. The noble students are housed there. I counted at least 4 patrols around the building alone. And Pokémon, Silk added. Several of them. Blade frowned beneath his mask. Sneaking in and out with both the girl and her Bration sounds nearly impossible. And causing a diversion? Root suggested. Mist slowly shook her head. A fight would lock down the entire fortress. Also, I prefer not getting killed if necessary when we can do better. Silence settled over the group once again. Only the distant voices of soldiers carried across the evening air. Finally, Silk spoke. "Supply caravans." The others looked toward him. "For a place this large, they likely arrive almost every week." He pointed toward the southern road leading to the fortress. "If we intercept one next week, we take their uniforms." Blade's eyes narrowed. "We walk through the front gate." Root immediately caught on. "The guards won't question uniformed workers carrying supplies." Mist slowly nodded. "We enter after dark, the girl first." She held up one finger. Anti-magic cuffs. A second finger. The Breakson. Restriction collar. "A proper one this time," Blade chuckled. Root nodded with a grin hidden under his mask. Mist continued as though he hadn't interrupted. "Once both are secured," she pointed toward the rear wall of the fortress. "We don't leave through the gate." "The wall?" Blade asked. "Yes, Root, you prepare something to land onto." Silk smiled beneath his mask. "Fast. Simple. No alarms until morning." Mist looked each of them in the eye. "It won't stay simple for long, so once the target is secured, we ride like hell." 3 silent nods answered her. The plan was decided. Without another word, the 4 agents disappeared deeper into the forest. A short distance away, they quietly established a small, concealed camp beneath the trees. The next day came down like a hot hammer. I had to admit, I rather liked the whole military setup, but just like Ventis, I quickly noticed one major downside: the smell. 100 men wearing full armor, drilling beneath the summer sun since dawn, created a wall of sweat that could have qualified as a defensive fortification all on its own. Colonel Grebe made sure every noble and their Pokémon were gathered on the training field just as early as the regular soldiers. Most of the students were still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The only exceptions were Prince Augustin and Ventis. "Take your unit numbers and head to your assigned training fields," the colonel bellowed, pointing toward a long table where officers were handing out wooden plaques engraved with numbers. Within minutes, dozens of groups spread across the enormous training grounds. "Line up!" Ventis shouted as loudly as she could. It sounded pretty decent. "You can do it," I sent through our bond, along with a wave of encouragement. She smiled ever so slightly before returning her attention to the soldiers. The morning began with simple drills, marching formations, shield walls, orderly advances, retreats, nothing particularly exciting. The Aura Knights assigned to the unit demonstrated every maneuver first before allowing the soldiers to repeat it under Ventis's command. She pointed at me. "Attack the front!" The soldiers locked their shields together while the Aura Knights braced behind them. I slammed into it several times, testing their footing, while the Knights barked corrections to the younger soldiers. It was textbook training. Then an idea crossed my mind. Tell them to prepare for an ambush. Ventis blinked before immediately turning toward the unit. "Prepare for an ambush scenario." Several of the Aura Knights looked surprised. This wasn't part of today's planned exercises. Still, they reacted instantly. The rectangular shield wall broke apart and reformed into a defensive circle, shields facing outward in every direction. I vanished with extreme speed. One moment I was in front of them. The next, I was striking from the left. I kicked shields, pushed against weak points, tried to squeeze through tiny openings before darting away again. The soldiers quickly stopped treating it like another repetitive drill. One Aura Knight even laughed after successfully blocking one of my heavier punches. "Again!" Ventis shouted, and sent the others too to harass the soldiers. Jolien followed my style. Primarina sends Surf at them, testing the shield wall while Noctowl attacked from above. The training continued until nearly midday. By then, my stamina was finally running dry, while the summer sun scorched the training grounds as though someone had hung a giant magnifying glass over the fortress. Aside from me and a handful of fire, and rock-type Pokémon, everyone was drenched in sweat. The order for lunch was met with visible relief. Unfortunately for the noble students, lunch was military rations. No special treatment. Everyone received exactly the same meal. Several nobles stared suspiciously at the plain bread, thick vegetable stew, and strips of salted meat. A few poked at the food, as though hoping it might magically improve. Ventis, meanwhile, accepted her portion without the slightest complaint. Compared to what she had eaten during 6 long years in Hagsrot, this was practically a feast. As for me, I couldn't have cared less. Food was fuel, and military food wasn't made to impress anyone. It was made to keep soldiers fighting. Day after day, we returned to our assigned unit. By the 4th day, I had exhausted all the ideas I could remember from my old world. From then on, we simply rotated the different drills into our daily routine. As far as I could tell, most of the other units stuck to standard military exercises under the supervision of the students. Though I did hear from Escavalier that Prince Augustin had borrowed a few of our training methods for his own unit. His new Vaporeon was female, and while the thought made me chuckle for a moment, I knew full well he'd only wanted one for the prestige of having such an elegant water type. A mage with a Vaporeon, a Lopunny, and a Gardevoir would have been a rather questionable combination. For a brief moment, I pictured a skinny man with a red nose giggling inside a wizard's tower. I immediately shook my head. Modern media was a curse. Though it was a fun curse whenever I had nothing else to occupy my thoughts. I even tried recalling episodes of the old Pokémon show, though most of them slipped frustratingly through my memory. On the 6th day, the weather finally changed. Rain. The cool air was a welcome relief after nearly a week of relentless summer heat. Of course, the officers immediately announced that today's lesson would be training under adverse weather conditions. I understood the physics behind storm clouds well enough to know that summer rain could become surprisingly violent. What I hadn't expected was hail. The icy pellets were small, no bigger than the rubber on the end of a pencil, but they struck with surprising force. Still, training continued. Our unit marched through the downpour, while half-melted ice relentlessly pelted armor, shields, helmets, and Pokémon. For most, it was simply miserable. For me, it was excellent training, which also meant that it hurt like hell. By midday, I was barely able to remain on my feet. The constant barrage had left my entire body aching, and at one point I had to block the pain from transferring through our bond because Ventis looked ready to collapse despite not having taken a single hit herself. "Want to stay inside your crystal ball?" she asked worriedly. "I'd rather not experience it," I huffed as I finally dragged myself beneath a roof once the training ended. I wasn't the only one. Many Pokémon weak to water or ice had already sought shelter or had simply collapsed from exhaustion. If there was one thing that made me feel a little better, it was the fact that I'd lasted the longest. Whether that was because of sheer determination or sheer stupidity was anyone's guess. After the rain finally passed in the early afternoon, most of the soldiers were too exhausted to continue training. Instead, every unit was handed buckets of water, rags, brushes, and oil. Armor maintenance. Colonel Grebe made his expectations perfectly clear. "If I find a single speck of rust on your armor," he bellowed across the courtyard, "I'll have you running laps along the walls until you faint." Nobody doubted him. As a fire type, I quickly found myself a useful job. Noctowl, a light breeze if you would. The owl gave a nod, gently flapping his wings. I added my own Ember, turning the cool wind into a pleasantly warm one that flowed over the freshly washed breastplates, helmets, and shields. Within minutes, the armor was completely dry. Our unit finished long before everyone else. "Well," one of the foot soldiers chuckled, "and here I thought most noble mages didn't care a snubble's arse about us." I guess I was mistaken. Another soldier smiled as he inspected his polished breastplate. Lady Balatoa has been a blessing. Indeed, one of the Aura Knights agreed. I heard several knights and soldiers have already asked if they could be assigned under her command. Too bad nobody's willing to swap, his companion laughed. Indeed. Several foot soldiers joined in. You'd have to be mad to leave her unit. The massive resting hall was pleasantly cool after the sweltering heat outside. Long wooden benches filled the room, with soldiers happily resting, sharpening weapons, or simply talking after the day's work. I wasn't really listening, but it was impossible not to overhear them. Ventis had already returned to our room with the others. I was waiting for Duot. He had asked if we could exchange a few military training ideas, and I was more than happy to help. By the time we finished talking, and I handed him a small list I'd written onto an old piece of paper, the afternoon was already drawing to a close. Just then, a familiar flash of psychic light appeared in the hallway outside. Huh? Curious, I stepped back out. Standing there, dusting off his sleeves with all the dignity in the world, was Kadabra. He wore a crisp postman's uniform complete with a matching cap, while a leather satchel rested over one shoulder. "Hi, Fenn." "Well?" he asked proudly. "What do you think?" I blinked. "You became an actual postman?" "Temporary courier," he corrected immediately. "County Velna himself designed the uniform. Quite handsome, isn't it?" I looked him up and down before nodding. "I have to admit, it suits you." Kadabra puffed out his chest proudly. Then he reached into his satchel and carefully pulled out a neatly folded envelope. "Special delivery for Lady Balatoa." I smiled and gestured toward our room. "She's inside." Ventis looked up as we entered. "Oh, Kadabra," she smiled. The psychic type bowed politely before holding out the envelope. Kadabra. Ventis accepted it with both hands. The moment she saw the handwriting, her eyes softened. "Terence." She carefully opened the letter. As her eyes moved across the page, her smile grew wider and wider. He did it again. "What happened?" I asked. "He went on another stone hunt." She laughed quietly. "And apparently it was his luckiest one yet." She continued reading. "He says he can't wait to tell me everything once I return." For a brief moment, the fortress, the military training, and the looming tension all disappeared. She was simply a girl reading a letter from friend. "I'm so happy for him." Kadabra smiled. "Kadabra." I translated with a grin. "He says that it's an honor to be useful." Kadabra adjusted his satchel before looking out the nearby window. "I was supposed to teleport back immediately," he said to me, "but it's getting late. I think I'll stay the night and head home first thing tomorrow morning." I nodded, probably for the best. Teleporting while tired sounds like a terrible idea. It usually is. I turned to Ventis. "He says he'll stay here tonight and teleport back tomorrow morning." "Of course." Ventis nodded happily. "I'll ask the officers to prepare a room." A few minutes later, and a bit of explaining from Ventis, Kadabra got a small corner room with a decent rug and pillow. Apparently, he used up most of his power all day delivering mail. "This day took everything out of me," I groaned, as I slipped onto my own pillow. "Indeed." Ventis nodded from her own bed, equally sprawled across the blankets. For a while, neither of us moved. Just before I drifted off, however, I noticed her quietly casting several familiar spells around the room. She had done it every evening since the assassination attempt. I looked at her blankly. "We're inside one of the most heavily guarded military fortresses in the kingdom. Do you really need to cast all those wards?" "I know." She let out a tired sigh while finishing the last enchantment. "It's mostly habit at this point." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "And practice. I'm 5 times faster than I was before." "You do you." I shrugged before burying my face back into my pillow. At the supply depot, 3 dark-cloaked figures silently crushed tiny enchanted stones in their palms. The already faint outlines of their bodies became almost completely transparent. Their employer had given them more than enough gold to use expensive magical items without hesitation. If they succeeded in capturing both the girl and her fire-type Pokémon, they would never have to worry about money again. Meanwhile, Root remained outside the fortress wall. Beside him, his Diglett tirelessly loosened the earth where they intended to make their escape. Root spread layer upon layer of hay over the freshly turned soil, creating a thick cushion. The drop from the wall was nearly 30 feet. Now, even a porcelain vase would likely survive the landing. Inside the fortress, Mist led the infiltration. 2 guards quietly disappeared into the shadows after Silk struck them unconscious, dragging them into dark corners where they wouldn't be discovered until morning. Blade dealt with the locked doors while Mist kept watch. The next lock clicked. The 3 shadows slipped through the doorway as though they had never been there. The first-floor corridor wasn't empty. A lone guard slowly patrolled with a torch in hand. No matter how effective their cloaking enchantments were, standing directly in the torchlight would reveal them. Without exchanging a word, all 3 leaped upward. Their hands and feet found purchase against the stone walls. They remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The guard yawned as he continued his patrol, completely oblivious to the 3 assassins clinging silently above his head. Only once his footsteps faded into the distance did they drop soundlessly back onto the floor like Meowths. They hurried toward the staircase, the 2nd floor. Mist stopped outside a familiar door. She pointed. "Blade!" The lockpicker immediately knelt beside the keyhole. On it, tiny tools disappeared into the mechanism. 15 seconds later, click! Blade slowly pushed the door inward. A flash of lightning erupted from inside the room. The spell struck him squarely in the chest. His body convulsed violently before collapsing into the hallway, completely paralyzed. "Damn it!" Silk hissed through clenched teeth. Without hesitation, he hurled an anti-magic orb into the room. The enchanted sphere struck the floor and immediately began suppressing the surrounding mana. The 2 remaining infiltrators rushed inside without a moment's hesitation. Then, clang! A bell rang somewhere outside, then another. Within seconds, the entire fortress erupted into chaos. Alarm bells thundered through the night. Shouted orders echoed across the courtyard. Somewhere outside, an explosion lit the darkness. Mist's eyes narrowed. One thought crossed her mind. That wasn't us. Whatever had happened, someone else had triggered the alarm. She didn't waste another second wondering why. Her mission hadn't changed. Ventis's mind was shocked awake the instant one of her warding spells triggered. Without hesitation, she activated every reserve spell she had prepared. A heartbeat later, however, a small orb rolled into the room. The moment it touched the floor, a crimson pulse spread through the chamber, suppressing every new spell. I was already jumping to my feet, but this time Jolteon reacted first. A bolt of lightning exploded from him and crashed into the doorway. He didn't stop. For nearly 3 full seconds, he poured electricity into the entrance, giving us just enough time to get ready. I made a mental note to congratulate Ventis for being paranoid later. As Jolteon's lightning finally faded, 2 dark figures burst into the room. They were difficult to look at. Some kind of shroud wrapped around them, making their outlines shimmer as though darkness itself clung to their bodies. They wasted no time. One hurled a spore burst that exploded directly in front of Jolteon. He barely had time to blink before collapsing back onto the floor, fast asleep. The other assassin threw an item crackling with stored electricity. It struck Primarina before she could react. They knew our team. They came prepared. Before I could gather fire in my paw, a thick black collar shot toward me. It wasn't thrown. It flew through the air as though it had locked onto my neck, ready to snap shut the moment it reached me. At the same time, another pair of objects streaked toward Ventis' heavy metal cuffs, etched with dark red mana-suppressing runes identical to those on the orb. I tried to dodge, but Noctowl reacted first. A shower of golden stars flashed across the room. His swift struck all three objects, knocking them off course. Instead of attacking, I lunged forward and kicked the suppression orb back through the doorway. Thunk. Fuck! A man's groan echoed from the hallway as the metal sphere slammed into him. Nice one, Ventis said through our bond. At that exact moment, two invisible walls of force slammed into the intruders. They crashed into the opposite wall, their cloaking enchantments shattering instantly. Ventis wasn't holding back. Her barriers pressed them against the stone like a giant vice. Unfortunately, that wasn't our biggest problem. Boom! A massive explosion rattled the entire building. The floor trembled beneath our feet. Screams erupted throughout the fortress. Pokémon roared. Steel clashed against steel. "We're under siege!" a soldier shouted from somewhere below. Without wasting another second, I tackled both assassins before they could recover, knocking them unconscious with 2 quick strikes. Behind me, Primarina was already shaking Jolteon awake, while Noctowl flew into the hallway. A dull thud echoed moments later. "The third one's out," he called as he returned. Ventis hurriedly threw on her clothes before grabbing her focus. "We're also under siege?" Apparently. I gritted my teeth as I dragged the unconscious men into the hallway. While doing so, I quickly checked my tail fluff. Revive stones. Enough. Then, a max revive. I tucked it into the easiest pocket to reach. Hopefully, I wouldn't have to find out what using one actually felt like. A booming voice suddenly echoed through the corridor. "Every student." Knight Professor Garrick Stonewall stood at the far end, shield raised as aura flared around him. "Proceed immediately to the western gate with your Pokémon. This is an order. Now!" He charged down the corridor, his massive shield leading the way as he cleared a path through the chaos. Nearby, Professor William Dawnmore was already casting layer upon layer of defensive barriers to shield the retreat. He turned toward the Royal Knights who had accompanied the students from the capital. "Protect the future of our kingdom," his voice thundered over the chaos. "Protect the nobles. Protect the prince." King Rhaegar laughed like a madman from atop his Charizard. The mighty fire type hovered above the battlefield, its wings beating against the smoke-filled night. Beside it floated 2 Delphoxes, their staffs already glowing, prepared to incinerate anyone foolish enough to come close. His army had carved its way into Vermont like a hot blade through butter. He was extremely pleased with his younger brother. Convincing 2 border nobles to betray their own kingdom had been a stroke of genius. Thanks to their treachery, the Zhao Sharan army had swept through the first defensive line without even slowing down. The few loyal soldiers stationed there had fallen like ants before a flood, attacking the second defensive line under the cover of night. That was simply his way of greeting the enemy. The first clash had been glorious. A massive section of the fortress wall had already collapsed, while his elite assault units had destroyed 3 of the 7 ballista before the defenders could properly respond. "Forgive me, Your Majesty." A servant bowed nearly 10 meters away, not daring to approach the blood-soaked king. "We only managed this much sabotage before suspicion grew." The man trembled as he spoke. Rhaegar merely waved a dismissive hand. "It matters little." A cruel smile spread across his face. "This battle is already won." He looked toward the burning fortress. "We'll take this place within 3 days." His eyes narrowed. "Did my brother's elite manage to get inside to capture the girl and her Pokémon?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The servant finally dared breathe again. "I saw them fly over the walls." "Excellent." Rhaegar threw back his head and laughed. "Then continue with the plan." 8 of Zhao Shara's strongest battle mages soared over the fortress walls atop their flying-type Pokémon before leaping into the darkness below. It looked like a suicide mission. Truthfully, it was. Failure wasn't an option. Every one of them had seen what Prince Kael had done to the 10 guards stationed at the royal Fennekin pens. Being skinned alive had been the least horrifying part of their deaths. None of the 8 even entertained the thought of returning empty-handed. The moment they spotted their target among the fleeing noble students, they acted. Now, all 8 mages extended their staffs simultaneously. Spatial magic erupted. The strain was so immense that several of them immediately drank mana potions, while others swallowed enhancement drugs, forcing their mana circuits far beyond their natural limits. 8 spells merged into one, and space itself distorted. Ventis and I were violently pulled sideways through reality. We reappeared inside a nearby corridor. The instant we materialized, stone exploded upward from the ground. Massive walls sealed every entrance in seconds. Not fast enough. Before the final barrier closed, Jolteon, Primarina, Noctowl, a single Aura Knight, and his Feraligatr dove through the narrowing opening. The last wall slammed shut behind us. The leader of the enemy mages cursed. He pointed his staff toward the trapped group. "Kill the others. I'll handle the targets." The remaining 7 battle mages immediately turned their attention toward the Aura Knight and the 4 Pokémon, while their leader focused entirely on Ventis and me. Knight Commander Lewis Tide went absolutely berserk. His Feraligatr launched himself at one of the enemy mages with a furious roar while our team attacked without hesitation. Jolteon became little more than a yellow blur, striking from every direction. Primarina unleashed a powerful surf that forced 2 mages to abandon their casting, while Noctowl relentlessly harassed them with volleys of swift stars. Ventis and I staggered from the violent spatial pull. My stomach churned violently as the world spun around me. There was no time to recover. Suppressive magic slammed into Ventis while a barrage of debuff spells tried to strike me instead. Confusion, blindness, paralysis, even heightened gravity. Every spell sought to make me an easy target rather than kill me. Both of us realized the same thing almost instantly. While the others were being bombarded with devastating attack spells, every spell aimed at us was designed to incapacitate. "They want to capture us," Ventis shouted through our bond. "I can tell." I barely dodged another spell, relying on flame charge to keep my mobility high. Jolteon was struck hard by a volley of ice shards. Several icy spears buried themselves into his back, forcing him to stumble. Primarina managed to keep one of the battle mages occupied with relentless waves of water, buying us precious seconds. Then, everything fell apart. A massive explosion threw Feraligatr backward, the scales across his chest scorched black. Knight Commander Lewis cried out as his left arm disappeared in the blast. His shield clattered onto the stone floor while he immediately pressed his burning sword against the stump, gritting his teeth as the searing steel cauterized the wound. 4 enemy mages suddenly turned toward me. I threw everything I had into dodging, every ounce of speed my body could produce. It wasn't enough. The 4 mages completed their casting together. A single compressed wave of psychic energy erupted toward me. There was nowhere left to dodge. "No!" Ventis screamed. Then, a figure blinked into existence beside me. Kadabra. He hadn't teleported in to attack. He had teleported between me and the spell. The compressed psychic blast struck him head-on. His entire body trembled. Instead of letting the overwhelming psychic power damage him, Kadabra did something only another psychic type could even attempt. He absorbed it, every last fragment of it. The enormous surge of psychic energy poured into his already exhausted body, overwhelming his natural abilities. The air itself began to tremble. His eyes glowed brighter and brighter, until everyone present instinctively shielded their own. For a single heartbeat, the corridor became nothing but blinding white light. Then, darkness. When Ventis could finally see again, both Kadabra and I were gone. Our soul bond still existed. Barely. It felt impossibly distant, faint, as though I stood on the very edge between life and death. For one frozen moment, Ventis simply stared. Then she looked around. The battle was lost. She clenched her jaw. Mana erupted from her body. With a deafening crash, the stone wall separating the western escape route exploded apart beneath an overwhelming burst of force. "Everyone!" Her voice echoed through the corridor. "Get back to Robert. That is an order." The collapsing barrier forced her own Pokémon backward toward the opening. "Joel!" Jolteon shouted desperately, trying to rush back. Noctowl immediately understood. Ventis had never, ever used that tone before. His heart screamed at him to stay, to fight, to protect her. But he also knew, if they remained, everyone would die. Without hesitation, he grabbed Jolteon by the scruff and beat his wings with all his remaining strength. Primarina cried out in anguish as tears welled in her eyes. Knight Commander Lewis looked at Ventis. Despite everything, she was smiling, only faintly. She tossed her wand aside. Lewis tightened his grip on his sword until the leather wrapping creaked beneath his hand. Every instinct demanded that he stay. Yet the veteran commander knew the truth. If he continued fighting, he would simply die for nothing. He raised his sword. "Feraligatr!" The great water type looked back. "Cover the retreat!" With a furious roar, Feraligatr slammed an aura-charged punch into the corridor wall. The stone exploded outward in a cloud of dust and shattered masonry, swallowing the battlefield in a blinding grey haze.